This story combines many of the atrocities that black people have faced in this country. The black teens I want to talk about faced injustice on all fronts, and they faced it for something that they did not do. This story is black history, but not the kind that you put on a t-shirt or create a hashtag for. This is the black history that is not pretty, and it's not easy to hear. But it happened, and it happened to black people for hundreds of years. This story is just one of thousands. Brutality has been a constant part of black life. It was used to capture Africans. Brutality was used on the slave ships, and brutality was used on plantations to force enslaved Africans to work for profit. Brutality was used on black people after emancipation and when freedom came to keep black people in second-class citizenship. Jim Crow and segregation built its foundation on brutality through lynchings. And as we moved into the 20th century, the law took over and continued brutality against black people through state-sanctioned violence. Black people in America were brutalized by law enforcement who then marched black people to the courthouse for another round of injustice, where more brutality through unjust prosecutions and executions took place. Today we call it police brutality, but 100 years ago, it was known as the third degree. The third degree was police jargon that originally referred to the intensity and the length of interrogations of black suspects by officers. But as the country shifted from racial mob violence to state-sanctioned violence, it increasingly began to refer to police abuse of suspects, especially black suspects. President Herbert Hoover created the National Commission on Law Observance and Enforcement. It was also known as the Wickersham Commission, after Attorney General George Wickersham, who headed the commission. The commission was charged with investigating problems in the country in law enforcement and how to improve the judicial system. The commission published 14 volumes of reports. The most important one was Volume 11. It was released in June of 1931 and focused on lawlessness in law enforcement. Volume 11 said that the use of the third degree was being used all throughout the country by police departments, and that black people in the South were suffering the most from the use of this barbaric practice. The commission highlighted several cases where black people were beaten by sheriffs and law enforcement officers with batons and fists, and kicked and hit with whips and blackjacks and rubber hoses. They would target their kidneys and their throats and their growing areas. They'd pour water in their noses to simulate drowning. The commission found that this violence and torture was being used on black people and that it was routine, even for minor offenses like theft and disorderly conduct and violation of segregation laws. It was being used to force confessions out of black people. One of the cases that the commission highlighted was that of Grady Swain and Robert Bell in Arkansas in 1927. Grady Swain was born around 1913. He lived in St. Francis County, Arkansas. He and his family were sharecroppers and worked on a man named Russell Collier's plantation. Robert Bell was born around 1908. He also lived in St. Francis County with his family. Robert worked as a mail carrier, and his father Samuel also was a mail carrier in that county. The Bells owned a small farm in the area. The other family involved in this incident was the McCollum family. They were a very prominent family in Grady Corner, Arkansas. This was a rural unincorporated area between two highways. William McCollum, also known as Bun McCollum, owned a store in Grady Corner. The McCollums had a small child named Julius. This incident began on December 29, 1927. 11-year-old Julius McCollum was playing outside his family's store in Grady Corner. Julius was playing with 3 black youths. That day he was playing with 16-year-old Robert Bell, 14-year-old Grady Swain, and 19-year-old Elbert Thomas. Elbert was a handyman who lived above the McCollum store in Grady Corner. Late in the afternoon, when Julius did not return home, his family became worried and went searching for him. Ransom McCollum, who was Bun's brother, found his nephew Julius's body drowned and cut off bayou about 200 yards from the family store. When he found Julius, his boots and his socks were missing, and it appeared that Julius had a bruise on his neck under his chin. The boat that Julius was in that day was covered in mud and had about 6 inches of water in it. Something had happened to Julius that day, but there were no signs that foul play was involved. But it didn't matter. Elbert instantly became the chief suspect for Julius's death and whatever had happened that day. Despite the fact that there were no signs of foul play or a crime being committed, everyone started to speculate as to what had happened to Julius McCollum. All the speculation pointed towards a black person harming Julius. Bun McCollum speculated that a robbery had occurred. He told the press that he had given his son $20 to take to his mother and that Julius put it in his boots before he left the store. There was a huge manhunt that began almost immediately after Julius's body was discovered. People in Greasy Corner were desperate for revenge. Mobs were roaming the area looking for black people to lynch. They captured Grady's 12-year-old brother, Garvin. Garvin was almost lynched. Ransom McCollum poured gasoline on Garvin and threatened to set him on fire if Garvin did not tell Ransom where Grady was and what had happened that day. But Garvin had nothing to tell him because he didn't know anything. Ransom then took the 12-year-old child and locked him in the icebox at the family store. He said that Garvin will only be released if he confessed to the full details of what Grady and the others did to his nephew. Scared out of his mind, Garvin told Ransom and the mob what they wanted to hear. Garvin implicated Elbert Thomas. He said that Elbert put a weapon on Julius and ordered Julius to take off his boots. He said that Elbert then robbed Julius and picked Julius up and threw the boy into the water. He said that the boy could not swim and that's how he drowned. Garvin then said that Elbert pointed a weapon at Garvin and told him that if he said anything, that he would take Garvin's life. Ransom and the mob were satisfied with his confession. They then took Garvin back to the bayou to look for Julius's boots. Once there, Garvin saw an opportunity to escape and he took it. He ran into the woods and kept running for 3 miles until he made it to Stump City. Once there, he got in touch with his father, who later came to get him to bring him back to safety. After the torture and escape of Garvin, the mob continued to hunt to hold black people responsible for what happened to Julius McCollum. Sheriff Joseph M. Campbell made the situation even worse by distributing over 1,500 flyers all across Arkansas that said that Elbert Thomas was the one who was responsible for the alleged crime. These flyers offered a $500 reward for Elbert's capture, dead or alive. The money was paid for by Julius's father, Bun McCollum. On December 30th, police arrested a group of black people. They were 16-year-old Robert Bell, his father Samuel Bell, Grady Swain, Willie Thomas, who was Elbert Thomas's brother, and a black man named A.P. Campbell. After arresting them, they first took the group back to Bun McCollum's store and questioned them there. They then took the group to the jail in Forest City. As the group of black men were being held in jail, Bun McCollum and his family took Julius's body back to Tiptonville, Mississippi for burial. Bun told reporters that Elbert will be found and he'd be lynched, and that he wished that he and his family could be with the mob to help them lynch Elbert. By this time, the mob still had not found Elbert, and they were desperate to find him so they could lynch him. Newspapers in the area reported that hundreds of white farmers had Elbert trapped in the swamp and were hoping to locate him so they could lynch him. A bonfire was ready as soon as Elbert was captured. As the mob and law enforcement looked for Elbert, Sheriff Campbell said that he was going to bring charges against Grady Swain because he believed that Grady helped Elbert take Julius's life, because he said that Grady was with Elbert when they left the McCollum store with Julius. The sheriff said that he had already questioned Grady once before to learn what Elbert had done, but he said that he was going to question Grady again to find out all that Grady had done that day. This is where things went from horrible to horrific. Sheriff Campbell and the other deputies took Grady and laid Grady on a concrete slab outside the jail. They then got a leather strap and proceeded to whip Grady until he confessed and told them what they wanted to hear. The sheriff said that he whipped Grady because he was being imprudent and he didn't answer his questions the way that a Negro should answer a white man's question. After whipping Grady, Sheriff Campbell was quick to tell the press that Grady made a full confession to him. But the truth is that Grady had not made a full confession. The sheriff then had Grady moved to a jail in another town. He then brought Grady back to Forest City and whipped Grady some more. Finally, after being repeatedly whipped by the sheriff, Grady could not take it anymore, and he told Sheriff Campbell exactly what he wanted to hear. He confessed that he and Elbert took Julius McCollum's life. Satisfied with this confession, Sheriff Campbell had Grady taken to the Arkansas State Penitentiary in Little Rock under armed guard to prevent Grady from being taken by a mob and lynched. A few days after Sheriff Campbell had forced a confession out of Grady and sent him to Little Rock, he decided to bring Grady back to Forest City for more questioning. Sheriff Campbell was on the train bringing Grady back when he received a telegram from an unknown source. The telegram said that Elbert Thomas had been found and had been lynched, and his body was found in the same bayou where Julius McCollum's body was discovered just days before. The telegram also said that Robert Bell and Grady were probably responsible and that the sheriff was to bring them back to the bayou so they could be lynched as well. Thankfully, the sheriff did not take Grady back to the bayou. He took him back to the penitentiary in Little Rock. However, Sheriff Campbell was not delivering Grady back to the penitentiary just for safekeeping. He still intended to have his purposes carried out. Once at the prison in Little Rock, Sheriff Campbell was met by Warden Shelby Lee Todd Hunter. He was not a nice man. Sheriff Campbell told Todd Hunter that he had a Negro that he wanted worked over because he was still lying to Sheriff Campbell. The sheriff was talking about Grady Swain, and the sheriff said this to Todd Hunter because he had a reputation for obtaining confessions. He had worked at the penitentiary for over 4 decades, and he had bragged about how he had obtained over 1,000 confessions from prisoners. What happened next is going to be hard to hear. Todd Hunter was no small man. He was 59 years old and weighed over 200 pounds, and he was used to being rough and violent with prisoners. Grady Swain was 14 years old and weighed 120 pounds. Grady was a small child. Todd Hunter took a 4.5-foot long and 4-inch thick rawhide strap and beat Grady with it. He beat him mercilessly. Grady said that he beat him like a dog. Grady was bleeding and busted open, and Todd Hunter told Grady that he'd keep beating him until he took his life. The beating was too much for Grady, and he could not take it anymore and finally gave a confession. This time, he implicated himself and said that he was the one who drowned Julius McCollum. He also said that Robert Bell was involved. This crime went from being the actions of Elbert Thomas alone to now being committed by Robert and Grady, and all because of brutality and a forced confession. After the confession, Grady was taken back to Forest City. This is where things take an interesting turn. If you remember, when all of this started, lynch mobs were roaming the area trying to find Elbert Thomas. They had proclaimed that he had been the one that committed the crime and he'd be lynched and burned for what he had done to Julius McCollum. Well, local whites changed the story to fit their narrative that Grady and Robert were the real culprits. On January 6, 1928, Ransom McCollum claimed that he found Elbert's body floating in Cutoff Bayou. Ransom said that Elbert was 20 feet away from where he found Julius a week prior. Newspapers reported that Elbert was a hero who had died protecting his friend Julius from being attacked by Robert and Grady. They did a complete 180 turnaround. Elbert Thomas went from being vilified to being a protector, but this narrative was necessary to continue to carry out Jim Crow justice on Robert and Grady. Bun McCollum, who had said that he wanted to join the lynch mob to try to lynch Elbert, now paid for new shoes for Elbert to be buried in. Elbert was buried the day after his body was found, and his death was recorded as being at the hands of persons unknown. This was a common phrase that was used back then to describe someone who had been lynched. The plan to blame Robert and Grady for Julius's drowning continued after Elbert was declared a hero. Grady had already confessed after being beaten at the prison. Now, Sheriff Campbell intended to get Robert to confess as well. He carried out the same plan for Robert that he did with Grady. He took Robert to the penitentiary in Little Rock to meet Warden Todd Hunter. Todd Hunter beat Robert on 3 different occasions. The first time was on January 8th, 2 days after Elbert's body was found in Cutoff Bayou. Todd Hunter made Robert take off his clothes and lie flat on his stomach on a concrete floor. He then whipped Robert just as he had done to Grady. Sheriff Campbell and Bun McCollum were both present for these whippings. A few days later, the sheriff and Bun McCollum were present again. Todd Hunter beat Robert again. This time, Robert endured 2 beatings. Todd Hunter took a short break between the second and the third whippings. At the third beating, they brought Robert back in and they made Grady sit on Robert's head to keep him still while Todd Hunter whipped him. When the whipping didn't produce the result that Todd Hunter wanted, Todd Hunter took a heavy rock and he bashed Robert in the head with it. 2 weeks after that, Todd Hunter had Robert and Grady brought into his office. He said he wanted them to make confessions again to make it official. In his office were Bun McCollum, a stenographer, and an attorney from Memphis. He told Grady and Robert that he wanted them to make the same statements that they had made weeks earlier to the man in the room so that it could be recorded. At first, Grady said no. Every time he refused and he didn't say what they wanted him to say, he was whipped. In the end, they both confessed on record to a crime they did not commit. After Grady confessed, he and Robert were brought back to Forest City. Shortly after that, on March 20th, 1928, they were both indicted for taking the life of Julius McCollum and Elbert Thomas. Not only were Robert and Grady going to be prosecuted for Julius's death, but they were also going to be forced to take the blame for what the lynch mob had done to Elbert Thomas. Because Robert and Grady could not afford to hire an attorney to represent them, 2 local white attorneys were appointed to represent them at the upcoming trial. They were represented by attorney William J. Lanier and attorney George B. Knott. The attorneys were not given any time to prepare a proper defense for the trial. They were appointed to represent Grady and Robert on Friday, and the trial was set to begin Tuesday morning. Robert and Grady's attorneys knew absolutely nothing about the case, and they had to work quickly to try to build a defense for them. the very first thing they did was to speak to Robert and Grady. So they went to Forest City and spoke to them at the jail where they were being held at. After that, they went to Greasy Corner to see if they could find anyone who would be able to shed light on what had occurred that day at Cutoff Bayou. But all they found was fear and silence. The mob's actions in the cover-up of the McCollum family had left the black population terrified to speak. No one wanted to risk being the next victim, so everyone kept quiet. The trial started as planned on Tuesday, March 27, 1928, just a few days after Robert and Grady were arraigned and appointed attorneys. Judge R.J. Williams presided over the trial. Grady and Robert's attorneys immediately got to work for them. They first filed a motion to continue the trial date. They argued that there was no way they could provide an adequate defense to their clients on such short notice, but the judge denied that motion. They then filed a motion to continue on the grounds that one of the crucial witnesses in the case, F.P. Todd, who was the coroner that had examined Julius's body, that he was ill and would not be available to testify at the trial. Judge Williams also denied that motion. They then tried a third motion, this time to disqualify Sheriff Campbell from his responsibility of summoning the jury pool for the trial. They argued that he was biased and prejudiced against Robert and Grady, and there was no way he could be trusted to be impartial in selecting the jury pool. That motion was also denied. Robert and Grady's attorneys were outmatched at the trial. In an unusual course of action, the state accepted help from Julius's father, Bun McCollum. He hired 3 private attorneys to help the prosecutors prosecute the case. The trial was simply a formality. After 2 days of hearing evidence and witnesses, the outcome everyone was waiting for happened. On March 29, 1928, after 20 minutes of deliberation, the all-white jury found Robert and Grady guilty of taking Julius and Elbert's lives. Judge Williams sentenced them both to death by electrocution. They were to be executed 3 months later on June 15, 1928. Robert and Grady's attorneys truly believed in their innocence and that they had been subjected to brutality and a sham trial. So they immediately began working on an appeal to the Arkansas Supreme Court to overturn their convictions. But the appeals for Grady and Robert presented another problem, and that was who was going to pay the legal fees and costs associated with the appeal for Robert and Grady. Little Rock attorney Scipio Africanus Jones, who was also the NAACP's chief counsel in Arkansas, stepped in to try to help. Scipio Africanus Jones is another forgotten hero in the fight for civil rights and justice in the years before the modern civil rights movement. He was born into slavery in 1863 in Tulip, Arkansas. Scipio was highly educated and had been trained by white lawyers and judges in Arkansas. He was one of less than 30 black lawyers admitted to practice law in Arkansas between the years of 1891 and 1923. During his career, he appeared before the Arkansas Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court over 20 times. I'm going to have more to say about him in a video we're currently working on about one of his most famous cases, the case of Moore versus Dempsey and the Elaine Massacre of 1919. Attorney Jones contacted the NAACP National Office in New York and implored them to get involved in Grady and Robert's case. He told them that the two teams were being railroaded to the electric chair, but the NAACP did not want to get involved in the case. This was not because they did not believe in Robert and Grady's innocence. The NAACP was advancing the cause of racial justice for black people all across the Jim Crow South, and because of this, they had to be very selective in the cases that they took on to avoid depleting all of their resources. Typically, they took on cases where they could set new legal precedents for all black people. Grady and Robert's case was just not one of the ones that fit this selection process. They were just one of countless black people who were being railroaded and facing unjust prosecutions in Southern courts. But Attorney Jones did not give up. He kept asking the national office to fund the appeal, and after several requests, Attorney Jones was able to get the NAACP national office to contribute $200 to the case. With the additional financial support, Grady and Robert's attorneys were able to file their appeal with the Arkansas Supreme Court. The appeal raised 2 points. They argued that Robert and Grady were beaten into confessing and that there was no evidence presented at the trial that a fatal crime had even taken place. To everyone's surprise, the appeal was successful. The Supreme Court said that there was no evidence to suggest that Julius McCollum or Elbert Thomas were drowned intentionally. On September 24, 1928, the Arkansas Supreme Court reversed Grady and Robert's convictions and ordered new trials for both of them. The success of the appeal caught the attention of the NAACP National Office. They were impressed with Attorney Lanier and Knott's efforts to secure new trials for Robert and Grady. Mary White Ovington, who was the chair of the NAACP Board of Directors at the time, wrote an article detailing the horrors that Grady and Robert had faced in hopes that it would bring more attention to their case. With the help of the NAACP and two prominent black men in Forest City, Josiah Blunt, who was a successful businessman and educator, and Wallace Purifoy, who was a minister and businessman and educator, they were able to raise funds for Robert and Grady's second trial. This time, the trials were separated, with Robert being tried first. The second trial began on March 5, 1929. This time, the prosecution came prepared to ensure that there were no issues that could be used to reverse the conviction. Judge William Davenport allowed Sheriff Campbell and Bun McCollum to testify that when the confessions were given and they were signed, that they were not signed under duress and that they were not whipped before they gave the confession and signed them with the stenographer. And the prosecution also had a solution for the Supreme Court, saying that there was no evidence that Julius and Elbert had intentionally been drowned. They had a 25-year-old black man named Jerman Jones testify that he was hunting the day of the incident near Cutoff Bayou, and he said that he saw two black people throw a white person into the water. He said that he ran after seeing this. There was no explanation given as to why this was the first time that he was ever saying this. Now, this is where things get interesting. After hearing the evidence, the jury began deliberations. After 12 hours of deliberating, the jury was unable to reach a verdict. Judge Davenport asked the jury where they stood in their deliberations. The jury said that they had conducted 3 ballots, and each time they were unable to agree unanimously. That should have been the end of the deliberations right there, and the judge should have declared a mistrial. But the judge did not do that. Instead, the judge told the jury to go back in and encourage the holdouts to change their minds and to reach a unanimous verdict. After 30 more minutes of deliberation, the jury came back and said that they had reached a unanimous verdict. They found Robert guilty. Judge Davenport sentenced Robert to life in prison. A second appeal to the Arkansas Supreme Court followed after Robert's guilty verdict. This time, the appeal argued that the judge was wrong to admit the forced confessions, and the judge's comments to the jurors encouraging holdouts to change their votes was also wrong. Once again, the Arkansas Supreme Court reversed Robert Bell's conviction. The Arkansas Supreme Court did not just reverse Robert's conviction, though. It also took the time to do something that you rarely saw at the time from a Southern court in the Jim Crow South. It spoke directly to the racial implications of the case. The court said that it did not matter that Robert Bell was not whipped immediately before he signed the confession. The court said that Robert's environment had not been altered or changed at all, and that he was still in prison, surrounded by the white man's walls, guarded by armed white men, and in complete terror of white men when he and Grady signed the confessions. The court completely rejected the prosecution and the state's theory that the confessions were fine because they had been signed after the whippings had occurred. For the third trial, Robert and Grady will be tried together and not separately. Before the trial could begin, a new issue arose that was completely designed to hurt their chances at trial. Sheriff Campbell and Bun McCollum worked behind the scenes to derail their case. Robert and Grady's attorney, William Lanier, was arrested on charges that he tried to intimidate the prosecution's witnesses. Attorney Lanier was forced to defend himself and go to trial to clear his name. He was later found not guilty, though. Robert and Grady's new trial began on March 5, 1930, but the trial did not go forward. Judge Davenport offered Grady and Robert a path to freedom. He told them that if they pleaded guilty, they would each get a 10-year sentence and that they get credit for the time they had already served since being arrested in 1928. That meant that they'd be eligible for parole in 1 year and 4 months. This was a deal that was too good to pass up. Even though they were innocent, they knew that they would never be given a chance to have a fair trial in Arkansas and that they would possibly risk dying in prison or being electrocuted. With the support of their attorney, Robert and Grady accepted the deal, but this was not the end of their ordeal. It was only the beginning of the next chapter in this nightmare. The deal that Grady and Robert took meant that they had 16 more months to serve before they were eligible to be released. But Jim Crow intervened, and things did not go as they hoped for. For the next leg of this journey, the NAACP hired black attorneys Joseph R. Booker and his brother, William A. Booker. They had the law firm in Little Rock, Arkansas. They were brought in to help with getting Robert and Grady paroled, pardoned, or let out early for a furlough. Around the same time, the Wickersham Commission report was released to the public, and it listed Grady Swain and Robert Bell's cases as one of the many examples of law enforcement using brutality and the third degree to get prisoners to confess to crimes. After the commission's report was released, Warden Todhern denied that he had ever whipped Grady or Robert and forced anyone to confess. Now, this was an interesting denial considering that he had testified at the trial and had already admitted to beating them both when he testified under oath. The Booker brothers thought they had a chance at getting Robert and Grady paroled by the Arkansas Board of Pardons and Paroles. They were wrong. The first board meeting was set for October of 1931. Robert and Grady's cases should have been considered at that meeting, but the board postponed the review of their case. The Bookers filed to get their case put on the November meeting's agenda, and that meeting was also postponed. At the December meeting, the Bookers were told that the board would not release Robert or Grady and that it did not intend to honor the plea deal that Judge Davenport had offered them. The board said that it will only recognize the time served by Grady and Robert that began after their conviction and sentence in 1930. That meant that Robert and Grady would have to serve the full 10 years. Things went from bad to worse after this. Governor Harvey Parnell was the only one who could lean on the parole board to enforce the plea deal. The Bookers spoke to the governor and he said that he was considering taking action, but Parnell was in the middle of a re-election campaign and did not want to be seen as helping black people. Another year went by and Robert and Grady remained in prison as politics got in the way of their freedom. A new governor was elected, Julius McCollum. The Bookers lobbied the new governor to take action, and he did that. The governor ordered the parole board to honor the plea deal that Judge Davenport had offered them and to release Robert and Grady. When the board met in July of 1933, it refused and ignored the governor's order. With the board refusing to act, only clemency from the governor would allow Robert and Grady to be released from prison. But that posed another challenge. In November of 1932, the Arkansas General Assembly elected a new member who was standing in the way of Robert and Grady's release. That new member was Bun McCollum, and he was pressuring the governor not to release Grady and Robert. From the very beginning of this incident, Bun McCollum had orchestrated every aspect of this injustice. He encouraged the lynch mob that captured and lynched Elbert Thomas. He then put forth the story that Elbert was a victim and drowned with Julius. He participated in beating the confessions out of Robert and Grady. He paid for the lawyers that prosecuted the case. He had Attorney Lanier arrested, and now he was stopping the governor from granting clemency to Robert and Grady. And this was all done to cover up a lynching that his family had participated in. 3 years later, on September 25, 1935, 7.5 years after they were indicted, Grady and Robert were finally released. By this time, Bun McCollum was no longer a state representative. Grady later married a woman named Georgia West in 1940 and moved to Little Rock in 1942. Records indicate that he registered for the draft. He died on February 17, 1948, at the age of 35, after battling a brief illness. It's unclear what happened to Robert Bell, though. Robert, Grady, and Elbert faced a horrific ordeal, and sadly, Elbert did not make it out alive. And the lives that Robert and Grady lived after their release were not much better because they still lived as convicted felons in the Jim Crow South. What happened to them is a story that must never be forgotten, because their story is black people's past and, in many ways, the present day for many black people. Injustice has not changed or stopped. It's just evolved. I want to know your thoughts on the story. Had you ever heard of Robert Bell and Grady Swain, and how did it make you feel learning all that they went through? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.